Hello and welcome back to our next Let's Talk version. We're going to be talking about storytelling on dates for men and women. It's going to be amazing. We're joined here by Dan. Hey there, Dan. How are you?
Life, as you know, buddy, is beautiful, as Jim Carrey said once, basically. So life is fantastic. I love it a lot. And we just finished all of our meetings. I was literally on my way here to record this podcast and got stuck in traffic. And it was actually a great chance to think and deliberate about certain matters and stuff. But for now, things are fine, and I'm glad to be here with you.
You know, everybody loves traffic. It's just one part of your life you cannot live without.
That's right. Well, I've actually come to love it as well, step by step. There are many opportunities by doing traffic. I recently realized there are so many opportunities in traffic that you've never thought of possible. I mean, like, let's be honest.
This is another topic, but this is interesting. Can you elaborate?
Well, there are many things. First of all, I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. So when you're in traffic, you don't have to focus so much on the road anymore. And you can actually listen with full attention to audiobooks. The other point is making phone calls, because generally it's illegal to make phone calls or text while driving. But when you're stuck in a bumper-to-bumper traffic, then of course there's no security problems in that regard as well.
I see.
And of course, when you're in traffic, things are slow, so you can actually look around a little bit for finding opportunities in case that's necessary, in case that's your thing. So that's the third most advantageous, basically, aspect of traffic. So I like all three of them.
So your point is you find something to like about any situation that you're stuck in. It doesn't matter if it's
absolutely
by nature. Yeah, it's like generally I never heard some people say I find some things interesting about traffic or good about traffic.
Well,
you are pretty much the first person.
You know, I think it's you and I both, we're entrepreneurs. So we have somehow learned to be adaptable and find good things in everything, because we are optimists to the core, and without it, we cannot even survive. So I guess that's why we can find good things even in traffic.
I see. Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's a very good attitude, because you have two choices. You can be miserable in the traffic while you're driving home or whatever, or you can actually make use of it. So I guess everybody in their sane mind would go for to make use of it. Just have to learn how to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyhow, getting past the deviation here, which occurred very naturally. I liked it. It was pretty nice. So today we're going to talk about, some advice in general in terms of dating, especially like one or two first dates. But like going further, we want to talk about like specifically storytelling in dating, because I'm personally very fascinated by stories in general. But for the sake of it, right now we're just going to talk about dating. We're gonna have another episode for for storytelling in general, and the reason is I think we keep telling ourselves stories. Like even when we're thinking with ourselves, we're telling ourselves stories, and that's really fascinating. And that's how we communicate mainly with each other. Even body language communication goes with stories. It tells tiny stories of its own. So
that's right.
Let me get you started with that. What do you think? First of all, what do you think dating is? Actually, let's start from scratch.
Well, dating, for those few of our listeners who have no idea what dating is, it's when basically two people who are interested in each other romantically and are interested in having basically a romantic as well as sexual relationship meet each other in order to realize whether or not they have chosen the right person. This is like for me, it's more like a dance where you somehow demonstrate your qualities to each other to find out if that person is the right one for you. Mm-hmm. And of course, when you're on dates, the most important thing you have to do is to talk. I mean, there are some people who just go, I don't know, they just go to cinema and watch a movie together, or they do things that are just so irrelevant. That's just stupid. Never do that. Never go to friggin' cinemas when you're on dates.
Right.
Ultimately, dates are about being able to communicate your good qualities to the opposite gender or the other partner, in case you're talking about homosexual dating, and you want the other person to somehow appreciate you and appreciate who you are. And this ultimately allows you to attract the partner and be able to somehow build and form a long-term or short-term romantic and sexual relationship with that person.
Right. Just to clarify, we are mainly focusing on the very first few dates. Like if you're into your relationship for a year or two, that's a different story, of course. I guess you know better. But yeah, like initially when you're going out for a first, second, third, or fifth, even 10th time with the person, the purpose is to get to know them, see if they're compatible with you, see if you can actually spend time with each other. So yeah, I agree with you. Like for very first date, going to places that you can't really talk. isn't really feasible unless you have a lot of time on the first date, so you can actually go to the cinema and then sit down and talk about the movie. That would be actually good because you get to know a lot about the person. Anyhow, but like,
I don't know about you, buddy, but if I sit in a friggin' dark room for 1 hour and a half, after that, I just want to go home and sleep, man. I just have no friggin' energy left to talk. Like, literally. I mean, like, you're in that dark environment, like, for friggin' 2 hours or so. Some of those movies are actually too darn long as well. So
yeah,
never recommend it. It's only good, as you mentioned, in the process of courtship, not when
right.
you're just dating. You just started dating. That's the worst idea ever.
Yeah, I'm not a major fan of it either, but in general I'm saying like the purpose is basically to get to know the other person. I agree with you. And so
Exactly.
that's dating defines. It has a boundary now. We know what we're talking about. Like, I know everybody knows what dating is, but I want to clarify so we are on the same page, everybody. Like,
Fantastic.
right. So, let's go on further, and what are I want to ask you this based on your personal experience and the things that you have seen, but starting with personal experience, what are the very first, early on when you were going on your first dates, when you were younger, what were the mistakes that you would majorly make on your first dates or second dates very early on?
You see, I think the biggest mistake that most men do make when they don't have enough experience in dating is, unfortunately, what we have also learned in the media, is that most men don't understand that talking to a girl is different than talking to a boy. I mean, that's the biggest problem. Right now, for example, you and I are talking, we have this Let's Talk edition thing, and the way I talk to you right now, Poujix, will be quite different than the way I talk to a girl, because ultimately we men are logical and we are result oriented, and oftentimes the things and the content of our communication with other men predominantly is about logical things as well as instrumental things. So we want to find out what we did, how we did it, and what's the results. However, women, on the other hand, they don't care so much about the logical stuff, and for them, especially on a date, they are concerned with stories that ultimately allows them to understand who you are. So the major difference between communication between men and women is what most guys understand almost nothing. And that's precisely the first and biggest mistake that we men tend to make on dates. And that is, we don't understand that we're talking to a girl. It's this woman thinks differently than other dudes that we tend to hang out with. So ultimately, knowing exactly how men and women would like to share their ideas differently can allow us to get rid of this serious mistake that we make oftentimes, which is why I mentioned this as our first mistake. The other common mistake that most men tend to make on their first few dates is that, unfortunately, they tend to somehow follow what we see in the media and whatnot. They buy a bouquet of flowers and they go to a fancy dinner. And these are some of the biggest mistakes that most men can make, because let's be honest, if you're a dude, you just met a girl, you don't even know who she is. Maybe she's got herpes. Maybe she's got a lot of problems, man. Maybe she's super fucking crazy. So when you just met a girl, when you do all of these things, when you buy her flowers and take her to a fancy restaurant on the first date, what do you signify here? You signify that I'm a loser and you are the coolest gift ever. Thank you for giving this loser the chance and the gift of your time. So I'm going to pay for your time. And that's just stupid. So the second biggest mistake is that guys take it too seriously. Guys, the first date means frigging nothing. On the first date, that woman means nothing to you because you don't know who she is. And because of this, the biggest mistake that most people make on the second date is that they take it too seriously. They make it too fancy. And that's, of course, another huge mistake. You were saying something, by the way?
Yeah, I was going to say, plus you don't know if that girl is allergic to some specific flowers or something.
I mean, literally, there's a lot of things here, man. And I mean, we all have made those mistakes, by the way. Of course, now we laugh at it, but when you're starting out, when you're 14, 15, and 16, of course, you don't have any clue, and you just do what you see on television, obviously. So that's the second biggest mistake that most guys make on the first date. And the third one, I told you, is just friggin' being boring and running out of things to say. That's the third biggest mistake that most men make, because unfortunately, we men are not as communicative as girls are. Because men, it's proven scientifically that most men use half of the vocabulary that is used by women, maybe even less than that per day. So this means that we are not very communicative in nature. And most men are what we call response talkers. It means they do not like to start a conversation or contribute something at the beginning. They want to respond to it. Like, That's a good idea. Yeah, it's a good idea. We should do this. Yeah, we should. Like, this is another serious problem because most guys are like this, especially more serious guys who are not into communications. And when they go on dates, it's just a freaking boring experience where you bore the girl out and she just asks questions and you just respond. Which should be the opposite, by the way. You should actually be the guy who contributes to the conversation and the communication. So that's, of course, the last serious biggest mistake. And there are many solutions that we can actually come up with to deal with all of them one by one.
So the first thing, like, while I was hearing what you were saying, I think the first thing that I was thinking of is to dial down the serious a little bit. Let's be a little bit less serious and just like be in a more have fun mood. Anyhow,
this is absolutely critical because if you don't do that, then you cannot, of course, tell good stories. You cannot have a good conversation.
True. That's true. Yeah, your stories would be super serious and with one line of introduction, one line of middle ground, and the punchline. That's it. Let's go home.
Exactly.
Time's up. Yeah. So that's that. And from your perspective, so this was mainly guys' mistakes. From your perspective, you've gone on. I'm assuming, I'm not suggesting. I'm assuming like many dates. So what were?
Let's assume that's true. Okay, no comments, neither confirm nor deny. But let's assume that's true. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, so yeah, let's say. So what were the few things that you've received when you were on the receiving end of things that basically girls did that put you off and you didn't like, essentially the mistakes that girls made that you didn't personally like from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I don't blame girls in this regard, but one of the most common problems that I have personal experience on dating is that oftentimes, especially at the beginning, most women tend to be rather shy and they do not like to contribute so much. And that's quite normal, by the way. Like, we expect that. In the science of dating, it's natural for the women to be a bit more passive, especially at first. And for
science
the guys,
of dating, holy crap! Sorry, is that a science, really?
Trust me, buddy. It is
okay.
We talk about that one, but it is indeed a science. Of course,
Amazing.
For me personally, it's more a science plus art. Because I think both elements are in it. But generally speaking, yes, it is proven both psychologically and basically in other sciences where you can actually combine a lot of different fields to come up with a science that allows you to get the most out of your dating experience.
Amazing. Cool. Yeah. You were saying, so that was the first
For sure, definitely. And as I mentioned earlier, most women oftentimes do not contribute so much. And the biggest problem for most girls, if they want to go on a date that the guy can actually enjoy, is when they tend to be too silent and too passive. I mean, it is natural for girls at the beginning, because they don't know the guy, to be a bit passive and just let him run the entire show, if you will. But ultimately, the women should also learn to contribute as well. Now, oftentimes, if a man knows how to be a good storyteller and be able to somehow warm up the conversation, then usually after a few hours, the girl also starts to contribute to the conversation and becomes basically somebody who shares her own stories as well. However, in most parts, generally in the first few days, girls tend to contribute as less as possible. And of course, it all depends on the communication skills of the man to be able to actually get the girl to talk as much as possible.
I see. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And as you mentioned, I agree with you that it's not necessarily a mistake. Rather, it would be encouraging that whenever they see a few signs of engagement, just join in. That would be like that. That's my personal opinion on the matter as well. And it also sometimes lifts the weight off your shoulder a little, so you can actually breathe. Let them talk.
Exactly. Finally, that's right.
Yeah. Well, that's the point. Like in the first dates or very first dates, it's a couple of them or 3 of them, 4 of them, whatever. You want to get to know the person, and if you keep talking, it's just like you are giving information. You're not necessarily getting to know the person. So it's nice that they contribute.
That's right. So true.
So that's a good thing. So yeah, we elaborated a little bit of mistakes that men make, and you mentioned very briefly how you can fix those. Can you elaborate on that and say like the mistakes that we men tend to make in their first dates, how they basically defy those mistakes?
That's
more
right.
Specifically, yeah.
Very good, very good. You see, ultimately, I think most men, if they want to get rid of their biggest mistake, which is not being able to tell good stories, they have to understand what is basically the different approach towards storytelling between guys and girls. Now, ever since I have learned the art of storytelling, Sometimes I find it very boring to talk to some of my guy friends when we hang out because I remember, just, we're back to square one. This guy's talking about bullshit. So here's the problem with most men.
Right.
Most of us men, when we tell stories, we talk about events and what happened in the end. So ultimately, right now, think about like your chat when you're chatting with your guy friends. Most guys, for example, let's say you talk to your guy friend and you say, dude, let me tell you a story about when I went to Thailand. And the guy asks, so when'd you go there? Was it like winter or summer? How much you pay for the ticket? You see, when you're talking to a guy and you're telling a story to a guy, it's more about the logical stuff, the details and how it happened. Because most often guys by nature are goal oriented and they want to get results. Because of this, when they're telling stories, they often talk about things such as, if you want to like tell your story about how I went to Thailand, is like you talk about like what airliner I used, how long it took, how much it cost. These lots of information are very important to guys. And if I want to talk about my Thailand trip with a guy, definitely these questions will come up because it's normal. Because a man is often planning his own trip to Thailand, basically, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well,
this is the problem with most guys. Most guys tend to talk about logical stuff. I remember once I was talking to my friend Alex, and he was telling me all these stories about history of certain things and whatnot. And I was bored as fuck, man, at that time. Like, literally, what the hell am I going to do? How can I get into this conversation? Because for most men, logical stuff, what happened, then what happened after that, and what's the conclusion? This is the typical male, basically, approach towards storytelling. What happened after that, and what's the conclusion? Because most men, we're action-oriented. We want to get the lesson and then do something with it. Now, here's the darn truth. Women are quite the opposite. Women do not care about the logical details of a story. What happened, then what happened, and what's the conclusion means almost nothing to the female brain. Instead, for women, what matters in a story the most is not the story itself, but the characters in it.
Right.
We call this character development. So for most women, it's the character development of the story that is exciting for them. Let me give you a story. For example, I heard recently from one of my friends, and it's about a story of basically a friend of mine who went with his friends to Australia. And these two guys walked into a bar, and basically at that point, somebody shouted at them with an Australian accent, "Some fake is walking here." Something like this, basically, right? So these guys, somehow at that time, these guys were shocked, like, dude. I mean, because let's be honest, they were dressed in a little bit funny way, which somehow could be assumed to be from certain backgrounds. And then they responded by saying, from where I come from, guys with a fake ponytail and tan are the ones who are faggots. And this actually almost led to a fight. And in that fight, my friend understood that this fight could lead to a serious problem. So what he did was that he tried to control the situation. So at first, he calmed everybody down, and he realized that if he wants to control the situation, he has to actually protect his friend because he cares about him, because he feels responsible for that friend. So ultimately, they ended up negotiating with this guy not to have a serious fight. They cooled down a little bit, and they talked for a while, and my friend actually decided to buy this guy a beer to somehow cool things off a little bit. But of course, this guy eventually got kicked out of the bar, and this allowed my two friends to have a great night together, and this somehow is the end of the story. You see, this is the kind of story that is interesting for girls, but not for guys. Why? Because here, did I mention where in Australia the story took place? Did I mention how they got there, which airline, how long they stayed, with what types of place? These are the things that are important for guys. But here, I just talk about the character of my friend. That is, he's caring about his friend. I demonstrated some characteristics. I mean, right now, you heard the story. What do you think are some of the characteristics that you can ascribe to my friend here, based upon the story you just heard?
Well, he was initially a little bit emotional, then he brought out his logical sense of himself and control the situation, controlling a little bit,
So he's the kind of man who can actually control the situation. That's part of his characteristics.
Right.
He's a loyal man who takes care of the people
for sure.
he cares about.
You already mentioned that.
These are the things that are important to girls. Who are you? Who is this guy? So when you are telling stories on dates to girls, focus on character development, not the goddamn logical details. And that's the biggest problem. So ask yourself, if you want to tell a story about yourself, how can I get rid of all the logical details and focus on demonstrating my character and my personality to that girl? Because that's the only thing girls care about especially when they're dating a guy for the sake of developing a romantic relationship, because they want to know who you are. That's their number one target. Who is this guy? Because for us, generally appearance is the primary factor, but for women, it's generally the personality that is a primary factor of attraction. And because of this, it is very important to demonstrate the right type of personality that is quite attractive to most girls on your dates. And if you focus on telling about people, about their intentions, about the emotions they experienced. You see, these are the kind of language that is attractive to women. When I was in the bar, I felt. When I was there, I realized that this guy is. After that, I felt. Then, given the fact that I am this kind of person, I did. You see, these are the things, these patterns, which demonstrate your personality and demonstrate characters of not just your basically own stories, but of course the other characters in your stories. This will all allow you to have a much better experience and tell much more interesting stories on dates.
For sure, and I agree with you. Like there are two. I can break this down into two sides of some stories, and that be how the story makes you feel, and what is the conclusion of the story. What are the specific conclusions in each?
Conclusions. Let me stop right now. Conclusions aren't for girls. Girls don't care about conclusions.
Yeah, no.
Girls care about who you are and what happened to your character. Like if by the end of the story, for example, it is proven, like let's say in your story at first you say things that somehow bring doubt in your self-confidence, but by the end you overcome all those risks and challenges. That's what's important for the girls, because they want to know who you are and how you changed as a result of the story by the end of the story. They do not care about the morale of the story. They do not care about the ending and what happened in the end. All they care about is who you were before the story, how you basically acted during the story, and who you became by the end of the story. So it's all the basically all this whole notions that you're expressing yourself by in the story is about one thing: character development. How did your character change by the end of the story? That's important to girls. What happened in the end? It's not important. So leave out all those things. I mean, right now we have this let's talk version, basically. This is a very manly kind of conversation that we're having right now, because ultimately it's about information. Because most of us men, we talk for practical reasons. Girls aren't like that. You see, when a girl comes home and starts chatting with her friends, she's not somehow talking about these things because she needs to understand what's going on with the world and whatnot, or she doesn't want to just know what's happening. She wants to share her feelings and know how others are feeling, right? So this kind of talk that we have right now with you on this podcast, this should not be used on a date, for example, because this is what we call information-driven communication. And that's something that is super boring to most girls and unfortunately very good for us. So we tend to confuse that. So on dates, you do not talk about information-driven stories, nor do you talk about action orientation or result orientation. Like, listen, have you heard about the price of this has gone, blah, 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 blah. These are details girls don't care about, you see. They want to talk about feelings, emotions, and characters, because women have this huge drive for sharing and caring, and they are wired evolutionarily to know who you are first before they want to see you again. And that is why it's very important to forget about conclusions of the stories or the morale or whatnot, and just focus on telling a story that demonstrates the kind of personality that most women find attractive.
Yeah. Again, as I was mentioning, there are two major sides and to a story for everybody, and that is one, conclusion, one, how it makes you feel. As you mentioned, there's in a romantic setting tendency for females are not to care about the conclusion necessarily per se, and then put more focus on the emotions that is carried out. What does this character make me feel, or what does the story make me feel, etc.
Exactly.
So it's more important to see what indirect messages you're conveying of the story. I agree with you completely, rather than what is actually you're verbally saying, or what conclusions, what direct conclusions you're getting at. What messages are you directly saying or indirectly? There are two different things, which shouldn't be confused, and it makes a good impactful, like in different settings even, which we're going to talk later. And in a story, it can actually have very good impacts or bad impacts, perhaps. But yeah, with respect to romantic settings, I think you're very right, and we men need to focus more on the emotional side of the story.
Exactly.
And when they're hearing the story, though, Like that's one of the things. Like again, girls have that tendency. They tell the story that, as you were saying, similar to this Australian story, which that was the situation going on and all that. And you have to be able to appreciate the feel of the story to be able to communicate to that person.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now moving on a little bit towards because I was gonna say something, but then I want you to first start this thing off. So what are the things that you would having said all these, what are the things that you would say to girls in this regard when they're either hearing the story or telling the story of their own?
When a girl starts talking about her stories, well, understand this. Generally, girls do not share a lot of stories on dates, especially in the first few dates. That is,
sure.
It is, in my opinion, the man's job to tell most of the stories, and then that will get the girl to open up to share some things about herself. But my experience, no matter how little it is, will somehow shows and proves to me that most often girls do not open up by telling a lot of stories, unless after you have somehow been together for a while and she can then open up and share more stories, which is why I think that as a man, the problem is usually like this. We are not good listeners. Another serious problem that we have on dating is that we are not good listeners. We don't listen to exactly what the girl is saying. And that's not always a bad thing, by the way, because I really believe that if you want to succeed, man, it's your job to talk more and listen less. It's just going to be a lot better for the girl as well, because usually girls are quite shy or reserved on the first date. And because of this, it's better for the man to talk most of the time. However, generally speaking, I really believe that if you are really into building a good relationship with a girl, then you want to somehow know who she is as well. Now, most guys might not care so much about this one as girls do, because we are, evolutionarily wired differently, but still, throughout the stories that a girl tells about her life, about what happened in the past, you can then understand what kind of girl she is. Maybe she's a girl who has undergone a lot of trauma in the past, and that has made her a little bit broken. Are you the kind of guy who wants to be a, sorry to use this word, an emotional tampon for a girl? Or do you want to actually be with a girl who has a healthy mindset? So these are all the things that you have to consider as well. And when a girl starts talking about herself, if I were basically, in the shoes of our listeners who want to go on dates and don't have enough experience, I would focus on actually knowing exactly what kind of characters this girl has and whether or not they are suitable for you. So by paying attention, again, to the character development, because oftentimes we guys are like this. We do not care about the character development. We focus on the logical stuff. So when a girl talks about, let's say, her own trip to Paris, for example, we focus more on the Paris itself and the trip and how she got there, and we don't care so much about why with whom she went there. How did she feel when she was there? So the same way that we use these tricks to tell good stories, we can also listen to their stories and somehow assess the personality of that girl and how she actually has come to be who she is today. And these things, of course, are very important when you're trying to form a long-term relationship, because if you miss some of these early signs, man, you can get into a relationship and then things get really, really ugly from then on. And you have to know who the person is. For example, a great experience is once I was on a date with a lady, and we were talking for a while, and then all of a sudden she grabbed my wrist and looked at the brand of my watch. Literally, like we were talking, basically.
Interesting.
We're talking, and then suddenly grabbing, oh, interesting. Okay, is that Rolex? Or something like this, right? At that time, I knew that this woman is what we call a gold digger, right? Okay. So when you know, I mean, this is a great sign. Look at the character of this girl. You're talking about certain stuff, and suddenly, oops, what's your brand? Okay, pretty cool. This simply shows that the person you're talking to is a gold digger. And then you're going to ask yourself, should I go on with this? Because we guys, we ignore that detail. Literally, most guys, we ignore those details. It's like, okay, who cares, man? I just showed off my watch to this girl. Ha, ha, ha. But that's actually a sign. Do you want to be the kind of girl for whom it is important what is the brand of your watch? If you aren't that kind of guy, then you should be very careful and not go any further from then on, okay? So these are things. We should pay attention to the subtle details of the girl's stories and behavior to know her character, and only then you can actually be able to form a very successful relationship in the long term.
That's very good and very true. You're right. We have to be able to, as men, pay more attention to those tiny details of the story that you mentioned, and their behavior, of course. And well, girls have the tendency to do that anyways. So, and again, men need to be careful that this is necessarily the case, and they might actually bore the girl, and actually you might be a good fit after the 5th and 10th date or something. But then if you don't get there, you never
Excuse
know.
me, how many dates, buddy? How many dates?
5th or 10th.
10th date. Because most of our listeners might be guys, because I don't want to mislead them right now. Guys, there's this rule called the 4-date rules. I'm a firm believer in the fact that if after 4 dates with a girl, you have not gone anywhere, and by going anywhere, I think you know what I'm talking about. If you have not reached a result by the 4th date, here's my recommendation to you gentlemen. Find another girl, because attraction is either there or
Right.
it is not there. Attraction takes seconds and minutes to form. If you are with
Yes.
a lady and you have been going on dates for more than 4 dates and you haven't even been to this first base, I'd say you guys have to do something about this from my perspective. So you mentioned 10 dates, because
Right.
I really feel responsible for this right now. To all the gentlemen out there, if by the 4th date you felt there is no chemistry, I would like to ask you to move on. Let that woman alone. She is not your type. You're not basically her type. This will allow both of you to later meet someone whom you can spark chemistry on the first date. That's what matters. So I do not recommend going on dates. That's another serious problem. Men who go on many dates do so because they do not know how to convey the right characteristics. And more importantly, oftentimes they are going out with the wrong person. Sorry, guys, you are not everyone's match.
Of
I
course,
am not
nobody's
every girl's
everybody's.
match, and neither are
Yeah.
you, Poujix. But the fact of the matter is that, Poujix, you are a lot of girls' matches, like instantly. I'm pretty sure some girls will see you, Poujix, and say, dude, look at that hot guy, all shaven and beard and all that. That guy is cool. And it's on
Thank you.
right away, man. Okay.
Right.
And there will be some girls for whom that's a problem. They say, no, I'm not
Yep.
going to hang with this. So why waste 10 dates on a girl? Or for girls, the same story. Why go on many dates with a boy that you do not feel attracted to at all? Just for the sake of going on dates, it's not cool. So ultimately, that's another deviation from the main topic. But I really have this called the 4-date rules. If by the 4th date there have been no chemistry, then I recommend you guys to find somebody else. Leave that girl alone, and you will do her a favor. You will do yourself a favor, and this is a mutually beneficial for both of you. Find somebody else.
No, I agree with you, and so I think you got me a little bit wrong. And first of all, I really agree with that. I think the chemistry is very important. And it's not necessarily something that grows. It can in some very weird cases, but then what are the odds of that? Where you want to waste your time on that? But what I was trying to say is that if the initial stages of that first date was set up and laid out differently, the chemistry could have been there. So what I'm trying to say is that you actually might like that girl, and that girl might like you, but not if you conveyed the wrong message. So what I was going to say is that if you do that, then you don't get to that point.
Exactly.
So that was what I was going with. But I agree with the notion that, if the few early dates you don't see any chemistry between the two of you, you're better off, letting go. There's very slim chance, not impossible, that it actually turns out really nice. But then, what are the odds of that? Like really, really low. So yeah, you don't want to waste anybody's time on that, neither yours nor hers. So I agree with that. Anyhow, back to the main topic, and we are also approaching the later stages of this talk today. So to have a wrap up on the story side of this first and second dates, can you give me put possibly a real example, but it could be a fictional one too, it doesn't matter, of a good date from starting, I don't know how you want to illustrate it, from the very beginning to the very end?
Fantastic. So
from
good date,
sorry, before you continue, from both sides of the aisle, like men and women.
Absolutely. A good date is a date where not only it is fun to talk with the other person, that is, you're having a good time, but you also get to know each other very well. So please avoid talking about random things that have nothing to do with either one of you. And especially in the first few days, focus more on stories that reveal who you are. A good date, from my perspective, begins by talking about random things. We call this bantering, by the way, in the science of dating. You start just bantering about random stuff until you get to the dating destination. Could be a cafe, could be, I don't know, a bench on a park. And once you guys sit down, and I do recommend you guys to actually do sit down. I mean, if you're dating, you're always walking or something, that's also not very good, because in that condition, there's no eye contact, because the girl cannot focus so much on your body language as you're telling that interesting story that you have, right? So you need to actually eventually sit down in a place where she can look at you and absorb your body language. And at that time, you have a great opportunity to share some of the great stories that happen in your life. And sometimes guys tell me like, Dan, I just run out of things to say on a date. Well, the reason that you run out of things to say is because you do not have anything to say. It's because your life is boring. So another great way to becoming a great storyteller is to have an interesting lifestyle where you can see a lot of things. Now, if you don't have it in your life that is exciting, then just take one travel one place, and you'll have a lot of stories all of a sudden. Your luggage got lost on the way there, and then something else happened, and then I found this one, and then somebody did this. So live a life where you have stories. Now, if you don't have any stories, then you have no option but to create stories, obviously, because you can't just not talk about anything on a date. But ultimately, a good date is where you share real, authentic stories that happened to you. And then in the process, you focus more on demonstrating your qualities and characteristics while doing your very best to leave out the logical details as much as possible. In the meantime, a good date is also about a conversation and dialogue. You're not supposed to go and start to become a speaker like, ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to talk about how cool I am.
Where's your PowerPoint?
I mean, literally, many guys are like this. They just keep fucking talking all the time. No, let the girl talk. Invite her in. Somehow try to get her involved. So a good date is where you guys are talking back and forth. And because of this, you want to make sure that you're asking questions. For example, let's say you're talking about the same story in Australia, and you get to the point where there's about to be a fight. Then you take a pause. You look the girl in the eye in a very nice, friendly way. And then you ask her, why would you not want to go to Australia, by the way? Or from your perspective, if you were in that situation, what would you have done? You see, you involve the girl in by allowing her to make decisions about how the story should proceed. And then once she has contributed, you then tell your stories. Like, actually, this didn't happen. This happened, right? So we keep talking. So I use this technique all the time. Like, I actually talk about a story, take a pause, and then I ask a girl, as if she has a say in the story, what would you have done in this situation? Or what do you think about this? Or I let her contribute somehow. Because if you're just talking on a date, you come off as arrogant, and it's fucking boring, man. I mean, if a guy talks all the time, right? So you want to invite the other person to contribute as well. And the best approach is to take a pause every now and then and ask her or him what he or she thinks, basically, and then continue the story. That's one part. And understand, a good date isn't just about storytelling. It is also about flirting, as well as many other things, such as role plays and question games, which we can actually cover in a future podcast.
Of course, yeah. We were, as we mentioned, we were mainly going to cover the storytelling aspect of first dates. And thank you for that. And before we adjourn, I want to actually get your final comments on the subject.
Fantastic. So understand, guys, your attraction for a girl is far more about your storytelling than it is about your other characteristics. You could be super rich, you could be super ripped, you could be super cool, but if you're not capable of demonstrating your qualities verbally in a good story, then you have a serious problem, which is exactly why I recommend most men to stop watching movies and instead read some books. In order to be a good storyteller, you need to have high verbal skills. And unfortunately, when you're watching a movie, you do not get anything verbally. There's only dialogues. However, ever since I wanted to get serious about storytelling, I actually began listening to audiobooks about certain stories. We call this audio spectacles, where everything is described. Because on it, when you're telling a story, you can't just tell the dialogues. You need to describe the situation. And this is not possible if you are a movie guy who likes to passively sit and observe. Because of this, my biggest recommendation to all the men out there, and especially for men, because women are generally good at it because they do a lot of practice, stop watching movies all the time and instead start reading fiction, romance novels, and other stories to learn how to narrate a story. A story isn't just dialogues. As a matter of fact, the dialogues are the smallest parts of a good story. A good story is about the ability to narrate a plot line step by step and describe the situation. As we sat in that dingy bar where there was
Set the scene.
Let's say, being alone in a foreign country, the sound of, for example, music was so loud, and we felt that everybody's smoking so much we're going to choke. You see, these are ways to describe the situation. When you're watching a movie, you don't have to do any of these stuff. It's all shown it's all visual and visually described.
Right.
So verbal description, and if you aren't already a good storyteller, if you're a man, there's a 99.9% chance that you aren't, then I highly recommend you to start reading stories and fiction. I'm a huge fan of nonfiction. As you know me, most of the books I read are all nonfiction because I believe in the value of education. However, I also read fiction. I also read novels and stories. And most importantly, I love to listen to audiobooks that narrate different stories before I go to sleep at night. So by learning these things, by improving your verbal skills and the ability to narrate stories, you'll be a wonderful storyteller, and you will see a tremendous, tremendous jump in your success in dating.
Amazing. That was a very impactful episode, I believe. And thank you, Dan, for being with us again.
It is my pleasure, buddy.
And thank you for tuning in again for one of our other Let's Talk versions. Hope to see you on later episodes. Here I am, Puya LJ, aka Poujix. See you next time.